if there happen to be some Buddhist texts in forms of inscriptions, of course that would be very, very invaluable, I think.
Let me try to put this the problem of I think transmission and translation we are discussing in a little broader religious perspective. Now, Robert mentioned that East Asian tradition, there can be multiple meaning to a term, and but still, people live with it. It's kind of interesting when we look at the use of religious texts. We can see at least two levels of we are making use of it. One level is like where we are using this appears in very much in exact example will be like a medical manual or something where there is one right way to understand, because you are using it for practical purposes, but still that again it can be changed into generation until or unless it proves really disastrous, so really not working. But in the Buddhist context, we can take meditation manual, for example. Yes, again we can argue that there is one particular way to understand it, because ultimately you are using it for practical purpose. Now, that is one level. The other level is when you take like a concept, Avalokiteshvara, how you break it, Avalokita Ishvara, or whatever any other way. Now you see this has been happening within traditions, but it's going without much of a problem, because whether you interpret Avalokiteshvara as Avalokita Ishvara or any other way, of course ultimately you know that what you are referring to. So in that sense, as far as practice is concerned, it doesn't make much of a difference. Now, if you take Buddha Ghosha's own commentaries, we have Buddha Ghosha giving, for example, etymological definition to bhikkhu, bhikkhati iti bhikkhu, because bhikkhu is the one who gets food. But that is for definition, like etymological meaning. And also he says, sansare bhayam bhikkhati iti bhikkhu. It comes out of totally nowhere with one more play of words, because it is kind of what I would like to call prescriptive definition. So prescriptive definition has nothing to do with etymological definition. So the word etymology doesn't really allow that meaning, but of course it is also there. So Buddha Ghosha can be operating in both levels, because it is bhikkhu, that's etymological level, and also in the religious level. So which is exactly ultimately correct is really is not questioned, because you don't really care about that very much, so long as you have these two different levels of, at least two different levels of use. Now, ultimately, I don't want to say everything, but I want to say tomorrow for my presentation, but I think in this, ultimately, the real adjudicator of the whole thing will be something like we'll have to look for something beyond etymological meaning, perhaps. I'm not undermining, the going after the precision of meaning, but what I'm trying to say is, particularly in the religious context, what is important is, the transmission of a text through practice. Now, for example, in the context of Sri Lanka, we have these Buddhist texts being really used for religious purposes, unbroken 2,000 years. Now, of course, with the discovery of the Chinese Buddhist texts and Sarvastivada and all that, we are talking about the Buddhist texts which have been preserved as some kind of historical monuments in a tradition, but not being used. Now today, of course, we are again, little bit interested in using them in religious texts, but these texts have not been used for at least for 1,000 years. They have been there, being translated into Chinese and then kept in there, but there is no record of unbroken use. So, but it doesn't mean that Theravada tradition has any extra mileage or something, but simply maybe it remains a fact that texts have been used in the religious context. But whether those people who used them understood exactly correctly is a question, because whether there is a way to understand exactly correctly also is a question. Anyway.
Yeah, sorry, I just taking up. I'll give it. Do you want to immediately respond to him first? Just before I give the, I just wanted to make a few comments to comment. I think you raised three interesting questions. Of course, it's indeed true that if you follow, let us say, a prescription and by misunderstanding text, you wrongly prescribe somebody, then you couldn't see the practical consequences. And this is also one argument why one cannot interpret the text in any way you want. You should interpret as the doctor had meant, right? So this is a legitimization of, or at least an attempt to understand what the text is trying to tell us. But on the other hand, I also understand that it doesn't really matter how you name Avalokiteshvara, so long as like it doesn't matter whether you call a rose or any other name. I think this is the point that you made. And also, with regard to the etymologizing, I think it's also interesting example is the famous example of the Tibetan translation of Arhat, which has been translated as Jachumba, as the four destroyer, as is popularized by Jeffrey Hopkins. But still, and it doesn't mean that. No, we can still, I think, ask two questions: where the people who are using these terms, were they aware of the historically correct understanding of the term, or were they deliberately using this against the historical or etymological, historically true etymological understanding? In the Tibetan case, in defense of Jeffrey Hopkins in this case, I would say Tibetans were well aware, because they did translate as Jachomba and Chobra Yoba, like somebody who is worthy of veneration. And this is supposed to be the, so to say, the historically, linguistically correct etymology, whereas Jachomba, like the destroyer of the enemies, is supposed to be kind of what nowadays we might call speculative, creative etymologies. And I was told, I'm not a Sanskritist, but I was told most Niruktis work in this sense. Niruktis do not always reflect the linguistically correct etymology. So I think these elements we can also bear in mind when we are talking about the cross-cultural transmission of, even translation of names and so on. And also, I think probably it's also not unimportant to bear in mind that sometimes this, even if it were a misunderstanding, that could lead to some fascinating developments in the course of the history. In fact, I don't know, you may agree or disagree, but even the word Dharmakaya that we so much use in Mahayana context, I was told that it just began as a simple metaphor. If you see the teaching that I give you, you see my kaya. That was the simple thing. And that one became like a philosophically very profound interpretation of even a metaphysical interpretation of the Dharmakaya. So sometimes this kind of etymologizing or understanding or misunderstanding can also give ground for fertile, ground for other further developments, which is fascinating as a history of, again, the transmission of Buddhism. So I give the word to you.
I wanted to respond.
I don't think that's turned on.
Now? This is the problem with transmission.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to the idea that
Please put it closer, sorry.
I wanted to respond to the idea that Chinese and Japanese weren't using the texts that were transmitted. There's an old saying in Japanese that to make a real monk, you have to study Abhidharma for 8 years and Yogacara for 3 years. They studied these texts very seriously. They did not study all the texts. So it's a living tradition. It's a serious tradition. The problem is that Buddhist scholars don't know all of these languages, so we tend to see things from a very limited perspective. In terms of translation and transmission, I wanted to very briefly just talk about the transmission of the Biennial, which I think is very important when you look at what does it take to be a Buddhist monk. Buddhism was in China for several centuries before they had a Biennial. So what did Buddhist monks do? They imitated Central Asian monks, Indian monks, with a very imperfect understanding of what they were doing. By the beginning of the 5th century, so Buddhism's already been in China now for 3-4 centuries, they finally translated the Vinaya. In fact, they translated 4 full Vinayas, so they have their Vinaya literature is richer in Chinese than in any other tradition. That didn't mean they understood much. These are very difficult texts. There's a lot of transliterations. There was no dictionary to help people. So you have to go for another 2 centuries before you finally get an authoritative commentarial tradition that helps Chinese understand what these mean. So this is Dao Xuan, very, very important figure. But even Dao Xuan doesn't solve the problem. So you go another 4 or 5 centuries, and you have a man named Yuan Zhao. And Yuan Zhao writes sub-commentaries on the commentaries on the Biennial. So the translation is one step. Understanding sometimes took many other centuries. To make things even more complex in the Chinese and Japanese case is once the Vinayas were translated, you also have Mahayana texts. So how do you reconcile the use of the Vinaya with Mahayana? Chinese wrote apocryphal texts. So what that means is Chinese wrote texts that they claim came from India when they, in fact, were composed in China. And much of Chinese and particularly Japanese use of monastic discipline depends on these apocryphal texts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my paper later today. But this is a very, very complex series of events that takes many, many centuries.
Yeah.
Just answer my about this the Chinese Buddhist monks. I mean, if I correctly understood it, as if you're saying that when they started being Buddhist monks, they really did not know their Vinaya, and then subsequently only after evolution of a couple of centuries they had their Vinaya. I think historically, of course, although I'm not a historian, subject correction, I mean, when you look at the Buddhist monastic tradition, although the things were not translated into Chinese at the very beginning, it's very unlikely that they become Buddhists. I mean, the monastic tradition followed without knowing the Vinaya, because it is the very essence of the monastic life. So what I would say is, even though it took several centuries for Chinese text to be evolved, that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have a Vinaya. Now, my understanding is subsequently what happened is when the people went into search of books and came back and translated, of course I'm again subject to correction, I think that most of these, at least some of these things were translated out of context. They were not in a practicing Vinaya tradition really. They were like, Vinaya texts belonging to different traditions. So that is the historical part, but I kind of tend to not believe that, that to begin with they didn't have understanding of Vinaya or Chinese Vinaya gradually evolved.
Yeah, I think there is very some fascinating issues here. I wanted to mediate a bit. I think one thing we should be very clear is that there is some sort of, a little bit of distrust with regard to the authenticity of another tradition, which I can see from the Tibetan perspective as well. There is an inherent sort of a distrust in the legitimacy of the transmission in other traditions. And a perfect example is Vinaya, of course. And this is one reason why there is a lot of difficulties in introducing bhikshuni ordination in the Tibetan tradition, because somehow the claim that to be able to transport a new bhikshuni ordination or introduce or even to recontinue and with the claim that, okay, we have this nun coming from Dharmakuptaka and so on, but are you really sure that there is this continuity? And so on. So, but therefore, in the Tibetan context, particularly with the transmission of text, there are two kinds of continuity has always been addressed. One is the so-called Peigyun, which I can translate as textual continuity, and the other is the Lungyun, transmissional continuity. Lungyun, that's the reading of the text or of scripture or treatise. And one difference is their perception is you can transmit a text in two different ways. One is just translating. Nobody has. You just translate by yourself. You have not had a master. It has not been translated by any authoritative person. You just translate yourself, and then you brought it to whichever Tibet or China or Japan or whatever. This, strictly speaking, is still interesting, necessary, but it is almost seen as an artifact. It is like a museum piece. It has no life of spirituality living in it. Right? So, at least for the Tibetan tradition, our tradition is considered living only if you have the Lungyun. Otherwise, it is a dead tradition. But still, it is better than no tradition, because it's still better to preserve a manuscript in a museum than to within the Lama's hand who is giving the transmission every day. So I can, on the other hand, understand why there is also at least some sort of a doubt, the liveliness of the tradition in connected with the text. But on the other hand, as a historian particularly, and it's also a matter of culture, I think, how Eastern Asian, how they perceive, maybe their own notion of authenticity is completely different. But from an Indian perspective, probably I could understand, because the Vinaya is defined, the livingness of the Vinaya, the life of the Vinaya is defined by these, at least in Tibetan Shisun Choba, you have to have this some very fundamental Vinaya practice. You have to live it. Otherwise, just having a scripture translated doesn't mean that the monastic tradition lives. So my attempt to reconcile is, I can understand some sort of a sense of distrust from certain perspective of certain traditions, but on the other hand, we can also be open and say that there are different ways of transmission, and there are different ways of perceiving the transmission and the authenticity of the transmission, and so on. So I hope that I
don't think it's a word destructive character.
maybe it's some sort of, I don't know, maybe it's not a choice,
questioning, I might say.
which is a legitimate,
Yes, you
problem.
say legitimate, yes, of course.
I think it's a legitimate concern. It is.
So here I would like.
Yes. Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. I think now we are talking about is transmission of text. So I think one way of transmitting is sort of copying. So I think I would like to little concentrate on that idea. So basically, since I have been working with different manuscripts found in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Northern Thailand, and so with these manuscripts, what we find is sort of copying process. I think mostly accurate. So I think we are very optimistic in the sense that when it comes to canonical text, so the texts have been copied correctly. So very few mistakes. So the mistakes are very limited to sort of small grammatical points, maybe missing of words, missing of characters. But as a whole, all these texts agree. So in other words, there are no recensions, different recensions in the Pali Tipitaka. So therefore, our task is actually when you study, we can see that the whole Tipitaka as a unit, they are well preserved. I think how this transmission in this well preserved manner took place is combining both written and oral together. So the oral tradition continued side by side with the written tradition, even though we tend to believe that with the 1st century AD, when the Tipitaka was put into writing, the oral tradition disappeared. But actually the preservation took place, it seems, using both, because otherwise we know that the scripts develop, like a Brahmi script, for example. initial stages, there were no the symbols to show the difference between short and long vowels. And then the double consonants, for example, were written as single. So therefore, we later we find that some restoration of with the new symbol systems, long vowels and differentiating short, long, and also putting back into double consonants into the text in the written form. So through this